In the blood-soaked chronicles of Heian Japan, one name is nearly lost to silence. Lady Taira no Tokiko. Born into the powerful Taira clan, she should have lived a life of comfort and honor. Yet at the age of only 22, she was led to the execution ground, her head severed in a swift act of political vengeance. Official chronicles barely whisper her name, but her death lingers like a shadowed echo, a reminder of how power devours the young and the voiceless. Lady Taira no Tokiko was born into a lineage that stood at the very heart of Heian Japan's shifting tides of power. The Taira clan, also known as the Heike, had risen from provincial warriors to dominate the glittering courts of Kyoto. Her family name carried the weight of military prestige and aristocratic refinement, a combination that positioned them as indispensable to the imperial household. For Tokiko, this was both a privilege and a burden. For every gesture of her life was tethered to the ambitions of men who saw in her not a daughter or a sister, but a strategic bond to be bartered. The Heian court was an environment of dazzling rituals, where silken robes rustled in candlelight and poems were whispered in lacquered chambers. Yet beneath this shimmering surface lay an undercurrent of merciless calculation. The Fujiwara clan had long mastered the art of controlling emperors through marriage alliances, but the Taira sought to challenge this dominance with their own daughters, nieces, and sisters. Tokiko's childhood, therefore, unfolded under a gaze that measured her beauty, her grace, and her silence not as qualities of individuality, but as assets to be used in the dangerous game of survival. Even as a young girl, she would have been taught the art of courtly conduct, how to walk so that her trailing robes appeared like waves upon a polished floor, how to compose poems in response to seasonal changes, and how to conceal her feelings behind veils of etiquette. She was not raised to be free. She was raised to be flawless. A flawless offering, a flawless token, a flawless sacrifice. For the men of the Taira clan, her existence was a chess piece meant to strengthen alliances and soften enemies. She was a living thread woven into a political tapestry where even a whisper of misstep could unravel fortunes. In the eyes of her elders, Tokiko was valuable precisely because she could be given away. To resist such a destiny would have been unthinkable, for it was through her marriage that the Taira would seek to expand their influence within the imperial court or consolidate bonds with rival clans. Thus, Tokiko's childhood was not her own. It belonged to the clan that raised her, the clan that decided when she would laugh, when she would kneel, when she would be promised to a man she had never chosen. The gilded halls of Heian splendor were in truth a cage, and from the first moment she drew breath, her fate was already being shaped by invisible hands. The blood of the Taira gave her status, but it also shackled her spirit. Her story began not with freedom, but with a legacy that demanded obedience. A legacy that would one day, in the cruelest twist of irony, become the very reason for her downfall. To understand the fate of Lady Taira no Tokiko, one must first enter the world of Heian Japan, a realm where beauty and bloodshed coexisted in unsettling harmony. The Heian period, stretching from 794 to 1185, was marked by a veneer of refinement that concealed a ruthless struggle for power among the great clans. Poetry competitions, religious ceremonies, and artistic flourishes gave the illusion of a cultured society. Yet beneath these layers of elegance, the court was a battlefield where alliances were forged and shattered with the same cold precision as military campaigns. The emperor, in theory, held supreme authority. In practice, his role was often ceremonial, a figure cloaked in divine aura, but stripped of real command. True power resided in the hands of aristocratic families who controlled appointments, land, and access to the throne. The Fujiwara had perfected this arrangement by marrying their daughters to emperors, thereby ruling through maternal influence. But as the century wore on, the rise of the warrior class, particularly the Taira and Minamoto, shifted the balance. The Taira clan, flush with military victories and political cunning, surged to prominence under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori. Their wealth flowed not only from battlefield triumphs, but also from mastery of maritime trade, giving them control over ports and commercial routes. The Minamoto, their rivals, remained a formidable presence, equally ambitious and equally ruthless. Between these two houses, the court became less a sanctuary of art and more a stage for power plays. It was within this volatile climate that Tokiko grew to womanhood. She was not shielded from these currents. Rather, she was thrust into them. Every whisper of rebellion, every rumor of alliance reverberated within her household. The corridors of her childhood echoed with conversations of strategy and betrayal, of enemies to be subdued and favors to be secured. Even the quiet rituals of the palace, the recitation of poems, the burning of incense, were charged with unspoken meanings, each performance an assertion of dominance or an appeal for mercy. To live in Heian Japan as a woman of noble birth was to exist at the intersection of fragility and necessity. Fragile, because her life could be overturned by decisions in which she had no voice. Necessary, because her body was the medium through which men negotiated their ambitions. For Tokiko, this meant that her identity as a daughter of the Taira clan was inseparable from the clan's struggle for supremacy against the Minamoto. She was both witness and instrument of a war that was fought in palaces as much as on battlefields. The tension between the Taira and the Minamoto would define the last decades of the Heian period, erupting eventually into open war. But even before swords were drawn, the atmosphere was already heavy with suspicion and rivalry. It was in this shadowed air that Tokiko's youth unfolded, her life tethered to forces larger than she could ever control. Marriage for Lady Taira. No, Tokiko was not a matter of love or personal choice. It was an arrangement forged in the crucible of politics, where each union was calculated to strengthen the reach of her clan. For a daughter of the Taira, marriage was never about the quiet dreams of companionship. It was a contract between powerful men, sealed with her body and her silence. Her wedding would have been a spectacle of refined ceremony, orchestrated according to the elaborate codes of Heian court life. Musicians would play the koto, servants would carry her lacquered trousseau, and her garments would shimmer with layered silks dyed in seasonal colors. To the eyes of the court, it was a display of beauty and prestige. To Tokiko, however, it was the moment when her identity as a woman disappeared entirely into the identity of her husband's household. The man she was given to may not have been cruel, but he was never truly hers. He was a figure chosen for his political value, a thread that bound the Taira more securely to another faction of power. Her role was to bear children who would secure the lineage, to stand as a symbol of alliance, and to obey. The Heian court celebrated women for their elegance and artistry, yet rarely for their voice or will. Tokiko, like so many noble women of her time, was praised for her beauty and composure, while her heart remained unseen. Within her husband's residence, Tokiko's life became a reflection of the larger game unfolding in Kyoto. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, could be interpreted as a signal of loyalty or dissent. Her household was not simply a private sphere, but an extension of political strategy. Servants whispered news from the capital, messengers came bearing demands, and at every turn she was reminded that she was less a wife than an instrument of her clan's ambitions. Still, Tokiko fulfilled her role with grace. The chronicles, fragmentary as they are, hint at her reputation for refinement and discipline. She composed poems, participated in seasonal rituals, and maintained the dignity expected of a woman of her station. Yet beneath the surface, isolation pressed heavily upon her. She had entered marriage as a pawn, and no matter how flawlessly she performed her duties, she could never escape the knowledge that she was replaceable. Her position in the family was therefore both exalted and fragile. She was exalted because she bore the name of Taira, because her marriage represented an alliance that others envied. She was fragile because her worth depended entirely on her utility to the clan. Should she fail to produce heirs, should her family's fortunes wane, or should suspicion ever fall upon her, her exalted status would dissolve in an instant. The Heian court was merciless in this regard. To be a woman of noble blood was to be placed upon a pedestal only so long as one's usefulness endured. Lady Taira no Tokiko embodied this paradox perfectly. Honored as a bride, but powerless in her own destiny. The marriage that should have granted her security instead became the very thread that tethered her to her tragic fate. Life in the Heian court was defined by its rituals, its poetry, and its refined sense of beauty. Yet behind this glittering facade lay an existence of suffocating confinement for women like Lady Taira no Tokiko. Though she walked through halls adorned with screens painted in gold leaf, though she wore robes dyed in the rarest colors, she lived within invisible walls that bound her tighter than any prison. The court dictated everything: how she dressed, how she moved, how she spoke, and even how she was permitted to feel. Women of noble rank were rarely allowed to step beyond the palace gates. Their days were measured by ceremonies, by visits to shrines, by exchanges of poems written on thin slips of paper. To outsiders, it seemed a life of elegance. To those within, it was a cage lined with silk. Tokiko, though married into influence, discovered that her voice carried little weight. Decisions about her future, her family, and even her daily movements were made without her. If she wished to express dissatisfaction, she was expected to veil it in a poem, subtle enough to be interpreted as art rather than protest. Silence became her truest companion. Loneliness haunted her chambers. The women around her, though equally bound by etiquette, were often rivals rather than allies. Each sought favor, each feared disgrace. Friendships could turn to betrayals in a single breath, and rumors spread like wildfire through the corridors. Tokiko learned to mask her emotions, to speak in half phrases, to smile when her heart trembled with unease. Even the pleasures of Heian culture could not erase this solitude. She painted, she listened to court musicians, she composed verses to mark the turning of the seasons. Yet each pursuit reminded her of the vast emptiness of her own existence. Beauty in Heian Japan was not an expression of self, but a performance demanded by society. Every word she wrote, every garment she wore, was scrutinized by eyes that judged her not as an individual, but as a reflection of her clan. There were nights when the moon hung low over the palace roofs, its pale light slipping through the slats of her chamber. In that silence, Tokiko must have felt the weight of her isolation most sharply. Surrounded by grandeur, yet starved of freedom, she belonged everywhere and nowhere. The Heian world revered the fleeting beauty of cherry blossoms because they fell too soon. Perhaps Tokiko felt the same truth pressing upon her own life, knowing that her season too would be brief. Her loneliness was not unique, for many women of the court endured the same fate. But what makes her story so tragic is that her isolation was only the prelude to a far greater cruelty. She had been trained to endure silence, to live without freedom. Yet she could never have imagined that the very silence of the records would one day erase her existence almost entirely. The world around Lady Taira no Tokiko began to fracture under the weight of conspiracies and shifting allegiances. In the Heian court, whispers could carry as much danger as the clash of swords. A misplaced alliance, an unguarded letter, or even the rumor of disloyalty was enough to unravel fortunes built over generations. For the Taira, the rivalry with the Minamoto clan was a wound that never closed. Political victories alternated with humiliating setbacks, and in such volatility, suspicion became the language of survival. It was within this fragile atmosphere that Tokiko's name became entangled with allegations of treachery. Historians may never fully uncover the truth, whether she was guilty of complicity in rebellion or merely an unfortunate victim of proximity. But her fate was sealed by the perception of guilt. The political landscape was ruthless. The emperor was little more than a sacred ornament, while real power shifted among generals, courtiers, and regents. Within this network of influence, scapegoats were often necessary. When a conspiracy threatened to destabilize the balance of power, someone had to bear responsibility. Women of noble birth, despite their lack of direct influence, were not immune. If their husbands or brothers stood accused, their own names were easily drawn into the web of condemnation. For Tokiko, her marriage, once celebrated as a political triumph, became her downfall. A bond meant to unite clans was reinterpreted as evidence of betrayal. Her lineage, which had given her prestige, now marked her as dangerous. To her accusers, she was not a young woman barely past her adolescence. She was a potential conspirator, a threat disguised in silk and etiquette. The charges came swiftly, like a storm that offered no time for shelter. Documents were read aloud in chambers filled with ministers and guards, and her name was etched onto the list of the condemned. There was little room for defense. In a court where appearances outweighed truth, her protestations, if she dared to voice them, would have carried no weight. Silence, the condition of her life, became the condition of her downfall. For a brief moment, she may have hoped her family would intervene. Yet the politics of survival demanded sacrifice. The Taira, like all clans, were willing to abandon individuals if it meant preserving their dominance. Tokiko's death would appease rivals, calm suspicions, and demonstrate loyalty to authority. Her life became currency, traded for the stability of men's ambitions. Thus, a young woman who had once been paraded as a bride now found herself condemned as a traitor. She was not condemned for deeds of her own making, but for being woven into the fabric of political schemes she could neither direct nor escape. Her tragedy was the tragedy of many noblewomen of her time, to exist as tools in life and as scapegoats in death. The political upheaval that engulfed her was larger than she could comprehend. She had been born into its currents, lived within its tides, and now it dragged her toward the unthinkable. The name of Lady Taira no Tokiko was no longer associated with grace or lineage, but with a sentence that would cut her life short. At the age of 22, Lady Taira no Tokiko received the harshest of judgments. Her crime, recorded as treason, carried a penalty designed not only to end her life, but to erase her dignity. In Heian Japan, execution by beheading was a punishment reserved for those accused of grave offenses against the state. It was brutal, symbolic, and final. The sentence was delivered without ceremony, as though her fate had already been decided long before the words were spoken. To the court, she was no longer a woman, but a vessel of danger, an example to others who might dare to step outside the invisible boundaries of loyalty. The elegance of her upbringing, the refinement of her education, the delicate verses she had composed in her youth, all of it dissolved in the face of a single decree. There is no record of her voice in this moment. Did she weep, plead, or remain silent? History offers no answer. What it does reveal is that she was led to her death with the inevitability of a shadow at dusk. Guards, faceless in the chronicles, escorted her through corridors she once walked in silk, now reduced to the path of condemnation. Beheading was both punishment and theater. It demonstrated the reach of authority, reminding all who watched that loyalty was not negotiable. For Tokiko, it was the cruel conclusion of a life spent in silence. The blade that severed her head did more than end her existence. It silenced the faint possibility that her story might have been different. At 22, she stood at the threshold of life's possibilities. She could have become a mother, a poet, a matriarch who wove stability into her clan. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, her death folded into the machinery of political survival. The court did not pause to mourn her. It moved on with its rituals, as though the absence of one woman carried no weight. Yet there is something haunting about the image of her final moments. She had been raised to embody perfection, to conceal her emotions behind layers of etiquette. Perhaps she faced her death with the same composure she had been forced to practice all her life. Perhaps her silence, once a mark of obedience, became in the end an act of defiance. Her beheading was more than a sentence. It was a symbol of how women were made to bear the burdens of decisions they never made. Lady Taira no Tokiko's fate was sealed not by her own hand, but by the ambitions of men who wielded power as though it were a weapon sharper than any blade. In that instant when steel met flesh, her story should have ended. Yet the echo of her death did not vanish entirely. Though the court erased her, though chronicles reduced her to a footnote, the memory of a young woman executed at 22 lingers as an indictment of an age that devoured its own daughters. The death of Lady Taira no Tokiko did not shake the Heian court. It was absorbed into the relentless rhythm of politics, where lives were extinguished and forgotten with chilling efficiency. Her execution was not marked by public mourning or by monuments raised in her honor. Instead, it was drowned in the noise of larger conflicts that consumed the era, particularly the escalating rivalry between the Taira and the Minamoto. Chronicles of the time mention the deaths of generals, the outcomes of battles, and the shifts of power that redrew the political map of Japan. Within these narratives, Tokiko's name appears, if at all, as a passing reference, little more than an incidental note. Her identity as a woman of noble birth did not spare her from obscurity. In fact, it ensured her erasure. Women were often written out of history, unless their existence directly influenced the rise or fall of a dynasty. Tokiko, executed in silence, was deemed unworthy of memory. Her absence in the records was not accidental, but deliberate. For the ruling elites, the easiest way to control the narrative was to excise inconvenient figures altogether. A young woman executed for treason did not fit the story of Taira glory or Minamoto triumph. To remember her was to admit that power consumed not only warriors, but also daughters and brides. Thus, she was swallowed by silence. In a culture that revered poetry and the fleeting beauty of life, the forgetting of Tokiko is especially cruel. The Heian court exalted the cherry blossom because it fell too soon. Yet, it did not preserve the memory of a young woman who was herself cut down at the height of youth. The paradox is striking. While noblemen composed verses on the brevity of life, they failed to honor a life that ended with unparalleled brutality. For those who knew her personally, her attendants, perhaps even family members, her absence would have been felt like a missing note in a familiar song. Yet grief in Heian society was rarely permitted to disrupt the surface of ritual. Mourning had to be contained, expressed in poems or in quiet offerings at shrines. Public lament for someone condemned as a traitor was dangerous, a sign of disloyalty. Those who might have loved her were forced into silence, just as she herself had been silenced. Her execution became a void, a disappearance that no one dared to name. While the court shifted its gaze to battles and treaties, the memory of Tokiko was pushed deeper into shadows. The cruelty of her death lay not only in the violence of the blade, but also in the indifference that followed. To die young is tragic. To be erased is unbearable. Lady Taira no Tokiko's story, therefore, is not only about death, but about oblivion. She was reduced to a ghost in history, a presence implied but rarely acknowledged. In this erasure, one sees the cold efficiency of power. To eliminate a life is one act, but to erase it from memory is the ultimate victory. Tokiko suffered both, yet history is never written solely by courts and chronicles. While official records turned their gaze away, the people carried fragments of Lady Taira no Tokiko's memory into the realm of legend. In villages, in whispered stories, in verses exchanged by wandering poets, her name surfaced as a symbol of fragility and injustice. The common people may not have known every detail of her life, but they understood the cruelty of her fate. For them, Tokiko was not a traitor, but a young woman sacrificed to the ambitions of men. Her execution was transformed into a tale of sorrow, told in the same breath as stories of storms and lost blossoms. In this way, she entered the tapestry of folk memory, not as an aristocrat, but as a symbol. Poets of later generations, inspired by half-remembered accounts, sometimes referred to a Taira maiden, whose beauty was matched only by her misfortune. These verses painted her as a fleeting figure, like a morning mist dissolving beneath the rising sun. In the highly aesthetic culture of Japan, where impermanence was celebrated as the essence of beauty, Tokiko's early death resonated deeply. Her story was not preserved in state records, but it lived on in metaphor, in images of flowers cut too soon, of waves breaking against unseen rocks. Legends also carried a note of warning. To some, Tokiko became a figure who embodied the dangers of unchecked power. Parents may have spoken her name to their daughters, not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson. That noble birth was no shield, and that the court was a place of peril. To speak of her was to acknowledge the cost of ambition, the silence imposed upon women, and the unpredictability of fate. In rural communities, where life was lived far from the polished rituals of Kyoto, her story likely blended with other tales of tragic women. Perhaps villagers lit incense at shrines and whispered her name alongside prayers for their own daughters. Perhaps traveling monks or storytellers embroidered her fate with supernatural elements, casting her as a spirit who lingered near the places where she had walked. Memory in such forms is fragile, but it is also resilient. It survives in ways official chronicles cannot control. Thus, while the court erased her, the people reclaimed her. Lady Taira no Tokiko became part of a cultural undercurrent that valued remembrance over oblivion. In their retellings, she was not simply a victim. She was a mirror of human frailty, a voice for those silenced by the weight of authority. Her presence in folk memory reveals the dual nature of history, Official narratives privilege the deeds of men, the clash of armies, and the strategies of states. Folk narratives, however, preserve the pain of individuals, the quiet tragedies that define the human condition. Through them, Tokiko escaped complete erasure. Though the court silenced her, the people refused to forget entirely. In this survival, faint though it may be, lies the enduring power of memory. Lady Taira no Tokiko's life may have ended at 22, but her story lingered in the songs of the forgotten, in the verses of the wandering, and in the hearts of those who knew that history is incomplete without its ghosts. For centuries, Lady Taira no Tokiko's story remained buried beneath layers of silence. Her name, if it appeared at all, was little more than a faint shadow in official chronicles. Yet the modern age, with its hunger for overlooked voices, has begun to breathe life back into her memory. Historians, scholars, and writers have started to question why a woman of such prominence could vanish so completely from the record. Their pursuit of truth has resurrected Tokiko, not as a traitor, but as a symbol of forgotten women who bore the crushing weight of power's indifference. The re-evaluation of Tokiko's life is part of a broader effort to examine the roles of women in Japanese history. For too long, narratives focused almost exclusively on generals, emperors, and warriors. The voices of women were silenced, their experiences deemed peripheral. Yet Tokiko's story proves that the suffering of women was not merely incidental, but central to understanding the age. Her death reveals the fragility of status, the disposability of human life, and the price paid by those born into families locked in endless cycles of war and ambition. In academic circles, Tokiko has become a case study for the intersection of gender and power. Scholars highlight how her execution exemplifies the vulnerability of women in political conflicts. She was punished not for her deeds, but for her associations, condemned not for her voice, but for the silence that others interpreted as complicity. In this light, Tokiko's tragedy mirrors that of countless women across the world whose fates were determined by the actions of men around them. Beyond the realm of scholarship, her story resonates with artists, poets, and ordinary people who seek meaning in the overlooked corners of history. Modern readers interpret her death as a reminder of how societies often erase those who do not fit their preferred narratives. To recover Tokiko's story is to resist the logic of erasure itself. It is an act of remembrance, a statement that even voices silenced by the blade can still echo if we choose to listen. In the context of the Taira-Minamoto conflict, Tokiko's death adds a new dimension to how we view the era. The Genpei War, remembered for its epic battles and the rise of the samurai class, is also a story of private sorrows, of families broken, of women erased. Tokiko's life forces us to confront the reality that history is not made only on battlefields. It is made in silent chambers, in court decrees, and in the blood spilled by those who never raised a weapon. Her return in modern discourse also carries a moral weight. To acknowledge Tokiko is to acknowledge the countless unnamed women whose lives were extinguished without record. She stands as a representative of the invisible, her restored memory a form of justice centuries too late. In her story, we are confronted with uncomfortable questions. How many voices has history silenced? How many names remain unspoken, buried in the margins of chronicles that glorify conquest while ignoring suffering? Lady Taira no Tokiko, once erased, now returns as a reminder that history is incomplete without its silenced daughters. Through her, we are called to listen differently, to search the shadows, and to remember that every forgotten life holds meaning. Lady Taira no Tokiko was executed at the age of 22. her head severed in the name of treason, her memory nearly erased from the chronicles of her age. Yet her silence speaks across centuries. Her story reminds us that history is not written only by the victors or the warriors. It is also written in the erased names, in the unseen tears, in the lives cut short before their voices could be heard. To remember Tokiko is to honor not only one woman, but the countless forgotten who lived and died unseen.